Good evening and welcome to the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies program, Contemporary Jewish Theology in the Context of Catholic Jewish Dialogue. My name is Matthew Tapey. I'm an Associate Professor of Theology at St. Leo, and I'm also the Director of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Rabbi David Mayan, the Cohn Chair in Jewish Thought. And I'm also joined by three distinguished panelists who I'll be introducing to you in just a moment, especially and featuring Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill. Dr. Brill will be leading our presentation tonight, and it will be followed by two responses, one from Dr. Holly Taylor Kuhlman of Providence College, and one from Daniel Herskowitz of Duke University. And allow me now to introduce you to each of them. Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill is the Cooperman Ross Endowed Chair of Jewish Christian Studies at Seton Hall University. Brill specializes in interfaith theology, mysticism, Kabbalah, Jewish thought, and comparative theology. He is the author of many books, including Judaism and World Religions, Christianity, Islam, and Eastern Religions, Judaism and Other Religions, Models of Understanding, and Rabbi on the Ganges, a Jewish-Hindu Encounter. His forthcoming book is entitled A Jewish Trinity, Contemporary Christian Theology Through Jewish Eyes, which will be published in October of 2025, and the book seeks to understand Christian theology in Jewish terms. Tonight, we are also joined by Dr. Holly Taylor Kuhlman, Assistant Professor of Theology at Providence College. Her publications include Romans 9 through 11, Reading Aquinas on the Jews, in the volume entitled Reading Romans with St. Thomas Aquinas, 2012, as well as an article entitled Law in Translation, Reflecting with Aquinas on the Promulgation of the New Law, in the book The Challenge of Catholic Jewish Theological Dialogue, published in 2025. Kuhlman was part of the initial organization of the Committee for Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange at Providence College. Finally, we're joined by Dr. Daniel Herskowitz. Dr. Herskowitz is the Smart Family Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University. Before this, he was a research fellow and lecturer at the University of Oxford and Columbia University. Dr. Herskowitz's book, his first book, is entitled Heidegger and His Jewish Reception, published in 2021, which was awarded the Salo W. and Jeanette M. Baron Young Scholars Award. His second book, The Judeo-Christian Thought of Franz Rosenzweig, is forthcoming 2025, and his current research is on Jewish involvement at the Second Vatican Council. Without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over now to Rabbi Brill. Thank you very much, Rabbi Brill. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It's an honor and pleasure to be this year's speaker for St. Leo's conference. And I especially thank you for this invitation. Today or tonight, I will talk about a topic that Jews don't usually speak about, which is the Trinity. Jews have generally seen the Trinity as inscrutable or as tritheism in the past polemical ages. But now in a post-polemical age, does the Trinity still resonate in the same negative way as it did in prior centuries? First, the story. I was in Rome for an anniversary of Nostra Aetate. Among the many delegate speakers was a priest who was proud to tell me that he studied at Hebrew University. At one point over the course of the week, I was standing with my wife in front of Il Gesù Church in Rome, and the priest who was there walked up to us and said declaratively, "Can't you just feel the Shekhinah here?" Now, my wife and I looked at each other about this rabbinic Hebrew locution from the priest, which he thought brought us together. But at the same time, my wife and I saw both similarity and difference at that point. He was using the rabbinic and then later Kabbalistic word Shekhinah, but what did he mean? On some level, the explanation of the difference between the Jewish and Catholic meaning will reveal the core of my talk. The Christian understanding is that the divine presence is Christ, or as eventually becomes formulated as the second person of the Trinity. He might have meant the Holy Spirit also. While in rabbinic literature, the divine presence is a free floating signifier of divine relationship, which becomes formulated in later centuries in many diverse ways as a philosophic divine providence, as an angel, as a Holy Spirit, as a lower manifestation of the divine. But for Christians, it always has to be coming back to a discussion of the Trinity. The meaning of the Shekhinah for Jews is loose, but for Christians, it would be fixed. Yet I am able to understand the common language of late antiquity, and I understand that we both belong to two different, divergent, interpretive communities. Now, I've been thinking about this project of a modern Jewish understanding of Christian thought for many decades. As heir of the Jewish Christian reconciliation of the latter half of the 20th century, I attended Fordham University, a Jesuit university, which was now open to Jews, where I obtained a doctorate in Catholic theology, where I learned Catholic theology firsthand. Consequently, instead of tentatively learning to understand Christianity, I am the one helping Christians understand Christian theology, teaching them to catch allusions in Christian Catholic classics and how to compare church documents. I am the one explaining contemporary Christian theology, including Christology and ecclesiology to Christians, rather than the one who needs it explained. The Christians that I encounter in New Jersey at a Catholic diocesan university are comfortable with Jewish instructors and somewhat knowledgeable about Jews and Judaism. Most have attended a synagogue service. The original obstacles to Jewish Christian encounter from 60 years ago seem remote when one teaches in a department of Jewish Christian studies that situates early Christianity in a Jewish context, teaches Jewish students to read classical Hebrew, and grants certificates in Jewish studies to Christian students. And my experience is part of a growing trend in the 21st century of theological education, in which there are many centers now of Jewish Christian studies, many institutions with Jewish studies is integrated in theological studies, and we now do theology in the presence of the other religion, like this very conference, this very talk tonight, which would have been unheard of 50 or 60 years ago. Now, I studied Catholic theology and understood the resonance, but it took me a while to formulate a method for understanding. And we can talk more methodologically afterwards, but there's a new 21st century method of doing theology called comparative theology, where the reader or thinker suspends truth claims and instead seeks to understand the other religion in terms of his or her own religion. And there are many leading practitioners. Some of you may have heard of James Fredericks, David Brill, or Frank Clooney, who do this. Their approach seeks to hold constructive theology and comparative theology in creative tension. The approach does not look for a dialogue to create a consensus or a oneness or a reapproachment, but how can I, within my Jewish faith, seek an understanding of the theology of the other religion? Comparative theology and interreligious comparisons are a field of tension between similarity and difference, between a sense of religious interconnection and recognition of the distinctiveness of the other tradition. To understand other religions, we have to penetrate the religious mindset of the other. Now, this method was developed by Christians in the study of Buddhism and Islam. How do I read those religions from within my own religion? So it is clearly not an attempt to create a common faith or common covenant. Surprisingly, my resolution to finally write my forthcoming book on a Jewish view of Christian theology came from my encounter with Hinduism. I had a fellowship to go to India and study Hinduism. In some respects, approaching Hinduism was easier than approaching Christianity because Jews did not have a prior negative historic relationship with Hinduism. Polymorphic Hinduism may seem theologically distant from Judaism. However, in the process of engaging with the diversity of Hinduism, I saw the ability to open new vistas of insight and to allow understanding of similarities and difference where previously the comparison was thought not possible. Now, if I can do theological comparisons with Hinduism, a religion further from Judaism and which I have not been trained, then I can certainly compare Christian theology to Jewish thought. We should consider in some way Jews and Christians may be related to way the various paths of the Dharma are related. Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, and Sikhs are related. They share common language, common interpretations, even if they're different. So currently, both Jews and Christians, both historians and theologians, acknowledge a common spiritual neighborhood of Second Temple Judaism and early centuries. Each religion made different choices from those early ideas. To use the common spiritual neighborhood, to see the common spiritual neighborhood is for Judaism to acknowledge the wide palette of positions in Midrash, apocalyptic books, angelic and mediator figures, and the gamut of Jewish mystical texts and early ideas of divinity, many of which did not continue into medieval Judaism. And for Christians who acknowledge that many positions in the early 4 centuries were unlike the eventual creeds and closer to Rabbinic Judaism. But certainly by the 6th century, Rabbinic Judaism and official Christian doctrine were quite divergent. But the important point is that from common horizons, the two religions gradually made different choices and that the differences are intrinsic to the two religions. Yet, as a Jewish thinker, I can see and understand the Christian choices. Before I turn to modernity, which is the major point of my talk, I must point out 2 things that I want to point out about from antiquity. One, what it used colloquially, I'm not being technical here, the term monarchism, in the sense that there's a hierarchy within the divine. Christianity is explicitly anti-monarchic. The 3 parts of the Trinity indwell together, are mutually interrelated without a hierarchy, and there's a fancy word for that, perichoresis. Judaism's hierarchy is the Christian heresy of monarchism. In addition, using in a very loose sense, modalism, which was also rejected by the early church, where the divine parts are just modes or attributes of one unified, undifferentiated God, is the view of most Jewish philosophers who assume that God is a unity and all the God language and attributes are just modes. I understand where the choices were made. I see where the choices occurred. Skipping over a lot I could say about the Middle Ages, but I jumped to the 19th century. In the 19th century, there was a great deal of anti-Judaism in 19th century thought. Judaism was painted as the opposite of Christianity. Often Christianity was seen as having Greco-Roman roots. Jesus was painted as a Galilean, not as a Judean, and not having a common spiritual neighborhood. On the other hand, Judaism, in a mirror image, formulated itself as the opposite of Christianity. Jews painted themselves as a pristine ethical monotheism with little concern for rabbinic and Kabbalistic concerns of God, and certainly a rejection of almost any late 19th, early 20th century thinker almost goes down and rejects the list of Christian theological terms. Now, my major point of this talk is that now we have a convergence again. Karl Rahner, the Catholic Jesuit theologian who died in 1984, has reworked the Trinity in a very different way. He affirms there are no separate 3 persons of the Trinity, but there are only 3 volitions, all in one essence and unity. 2, the distinctions of the Trinity are relative and not absolute. And three, the three parts do not have separate consciousness or personhood. Now, Catholic theologians sometimes claim that Rahner is weak on the role of persons, which would make him slide closer to a mode position, a modalist position. But these criteria actually bring his view of the Trinity closer to a Jewish perspective. Since modalism is a position that Judaism can accept, Rahner is not actually a modalist, not in any way, but he comes close enough from a Jewish perspective to already start being able to see an affinity. The position that Rahner rejects, that the divine persons are mere created masks and not essential to or identical with the one individual God behind them, is in fact the Jewish position. But the position that Rahner is rejecting is already a Jewish one, and the Jewish understanding is already can be found within the writings of Rahner. For Judaism, the lower interdivine structures are in some level mere masks and never have their own volition, while for Christianity, they have equal status with the Father, and different theologies are able to be understood by the other. So we have a certain return to convergence. A more complex thinker I want to turn to now is Jürgen Moltmann, one of the most widely read theologians of the second half of the 20th century. And importantly, he consciously writes as a post-Holocaust Christian theologian, wanting to take into account the Holocaust and suffering of the Jews, and clearly seeking a certain amount of convergence, and not going into the complexity of how Moltmann deals with Lutheran and Calvinist and Eastern Orthodox thought. But he clearly, when he looks at the Jewish side of things, says that his doctrine of God begins with the suffering of life as evident in the Holocaust and the divine plurality evident within the mission of the Trinity. Moltmann discusses the position of God based on Jewish sources such as Abraham Joshua Heschel or Franz Rosenzweig. And Moltmann thinks Jews and Christians come from the same spiritual neighborhood. Moltmann asserts that the very Christian ideas of incarnation of the divine logos, and the indwelling of the Holy Spirit developed in the same spiritual neighborhood as Jewish ideas of the Shekhinah, Jewish ideas of exile, Jewish ideas of original sin. Moltmann writes that, of course, Tertullian's formulation of the Trinity uses Greek philosophy of Neoplatonism. Yet Moltmann says we should look back at the original Hebraic terminology. Moltmann continues, as the New Testament shows, in actual fact, the Trinity goes back to Israelite discussions of God and the Shekhinah, that the God who lives in heaven and among the wretched of his people reveals a double presence, what the Jewish thinker Abraham Joshua Heschel calls a bipolarity, the unknown God and the God appearing. But Moltmann says that where the Jewish understanding for Heschel is a dual presence, Moltmann says he wants to understand it as a triple presence. For Moltmann, the people suffer exile and persecution, and the Shekhinah suffers with them. The Shekhinah suffers exile, and the people suffer with the Shekhinah. And Moltmann asserts, and I quote, Abraham Joshua Heschel has shown that the Jewish experience of God cannot be a simple monotheism, because on the basis of the experience of the divine pathos, it must come to an awareness of the self-distinction of God. Every self-communication presumes a self-distinction. Whoever speaks of the communicability of God presupposes a relationship in which God can step over against God. And I must point out where he's reading it as a trinity, Jews read it as a hierarchy in a different way, but we're now on the same conversation. Moltmann's second movement of Trinitarian thought is to use the Kabbalistic idea of Tzimtzum, God's contraction, as presented by Gershon Shalom. Now, Moltmann understands that God has released a certain sector of his being from which he has withdrawn, And into this, accordingly, he brings his creation and revelation. God's contraction, Tzimtzum from Moltmann, means incarnation and kenosis, which he identifies with the Trinity, or the second person of the Trinity. But for Jews, Tzimtzum does not mean Shechina. It doesn't mean kenosis. It means a hollow or an absence of God, in which Tzimtzum is an empty space, a gap, an aphoria, which is then filled with divine light. The Tzimtzum is not an actual part of the divine itself. For Jews, the Shekhinah accompanies Israel in the desert, is a created lower level of the divine, existing in hierarchy with higher parts of the divine. For Moltmann, the Shekhinah going with the Israelites in the desert is the second person of the Trinity. The Shekhinah tradition helps Moltmann arrive at divine unity with the theological concept of divine mutual indwelling, the Christian perichoresis. But since Jews do not use this concept of indwelling, there still remains a difference. Now, Moltmann himself admits he tries to close the gap between Judaism and Christianity, and we must give him credit. He certainly does, because once again, as in late antiquity, we're using the same language and we can actually talk about our differences. Now, to drive the main point of my paper home, modern Christian theology, especially in the forms I'm going to talk about, like Rahner or Moltmann, has largely moved beyond the focus on Augustine, moved beyond the Neoplatonic focus as its major way to formulate itself. And the textbook understandings of Christianity, as known by most Jews, are frozen in a medieval scholastic form, frozen in a medieval Neoplatonic form. But it's given way to new theologians like Karl Rahner, Hans-Ur Balthasar, Jürgen Moltmann, Walter Kasper, and moving beyond that to Elizabeth Johnson, David Tracy, and many others who I don't want to slight anyone, many others who are no longer using that Neoplatonic language. So when I look at contemporary theologians, I can understand them in Jewish terms in ways that for many Christian theologians of prior centuries, I don't have the same resonance. Meaning after Kant and Hegel, after existentialism, after hermeneutics, after the social sciences, we read the same books and ideas, have have conversations, study in the same graduate programs. And so therefore a modal theological, or a Trinitarian position such as Rahner's is less different than a philosophic understanding of Judaism, even though there are still differences. While Moltmann's Trinitarian position of contraction, Tzimtzum, and kenosis veers to Kabbalistic resonances, once again, a language that I understand, that I can talk about our differences in a way that I could not necessarily do in prior centuries. These same divergences apply when we look at incarnation or original sin. Many modern Christian thinkers show that incarnation is also from a common spiritual neighborhood of God indwelling in the tabernacle, in the temple, as well as the common second temple ascents of humans to heaven and the divine manifestation in human forms on earth. And they're all seen as forms of incarnation. And that's certainly the way someone like Cardinal Walter Kasper presents it. He looks for resonance within that Second Temple Judaism. More importantly, Jewish scholars like Moshe Idel notes that many forms of incarnation actually do exist in Second Temple Judaism and in the early centuries, but have no intrinsic relationship to Christianity. This was just the way late antiquity thought. They thought in terms of incarnations, sonships, progressions. The modern Jewish thinkers, Michael Wishograd, Pinchas Lapid, Andre Nahar, all state that Judaism could accommodate forms of incarnation as biblical and rabbinic, but we differ over the specific incarnation of Christ, with his incarnation as salvific and messianic and removing of original sin. The thinkers Karl Rahner and Jürgen Moltmann both show how God indwells in our reality, moving beyond the Neoplatonic schemes, moving beyond that incarnation is only needed after the fall to remove sin. And both of them want to place it as part of the God's original plan for God dwelling with us on earth. More excitingly, for my purpose here, and it shows the example of how widespread this is, someone like Professor Elizabeth Johnson from Fordham University, who openly rejected the Anselm negative view of nature that needed to be overcome. Instead, she affirmed an inclusive original blessing of incarnation of God in Genesis to all creation. In this, Elizabeth Johnson has moved the discussion much closer to a Jewish position that the world was good at creation. God saw that it was good. Everything is blessed. God acts through the good creation, through the exodus from Egypt, through the building of temple. It's all a good divine plan. We got to choose good because God is good and his goodness is already dwelling in creation, and all of creation is part of God's indwelling. Here we see a very strong convergence between religions, so much so that even when she describes God's indwelling in all things within the natural order, she doesn't sound very much different than the divine immanence I know from Midrash or Kabbalah, that there's no place devoid of the divine. Now, this is all from one point of view, from a Jewish looking at Christian thought. But it's sometimes I'm surprising myself that it can go the other direction. Is that when I look at their very own Jewish texts that I've been reading for a very long time, after reading the Christian texts, I can see them in very different forms. So, for example, the great 20th century Orthodox Jewish thinker, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, speaks of various modes by which God is known. Soloveitchik differentiates between God as the transcendent and God as immanent. God in the book of Genesis is immanent and involved in the natural order of creation, similar to Elizabeth Johnson. And in the book of Exodus, God is transcendent and the giver of the law. In addition, Soloveitchik adds a third element about God goes into exile with his people. Soloveitchik speaks of interdivine structures, specifically God is immanent, transcendent, and with his people. Both religions have multiple manifestations and existences of God, but how do you explain the multiplicity? One side will use the rubric of the Trinity, and the other side will see God in various modes, see these as attributes of one single undifferentiated divine. Both communities are sharing common early centuries thinking of the unknown divine, the divine who hears our prayers, the divine in our hearts. Yet Judaism and Christianity puts these ideas together in different ways. Judaism will always either arrange these ideas as modes or attributes or in a hierarchy, while Christians will tend to go back to the Trinitarian thought. But now, after someone like Karl Rahner, if there are three self-existences, there's a level that is much closer to a way that I can even understand. And I'm not even going into the technical points, how a lot of these thinkers share various Kantian, Hegelian, existential background to their writings. So to draw this in somewhat to a conclusion, but a long conclusion, We remain different theologically and religiously. We are liturgically different, historically different, a different sense of lived religion. The rabbinic turn to the law and to working out dialectics of halacha is very different than the Council of Nicaea and its concerns. Judaism does not have a trinity or an incarnation in Christ or an original sin that needs salvation, but one can look with a sense of comparative theology as a faith seeking understanding and make sense of Christian ideas in Jewish terms. We started from a similar spiritual neighborhood. We greatly diverged in late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and in early modern period. And now in the 21st century, we are converging again. We teach and study in each other's graduate programs in which Jews study Christian thought and text and Christians study Jewish thought and text. We have to learn to understand each other again, but without eliding differences. For Christians, the Trinity remains a theological view of God affirmed in creed and liturgy, while for Jews and the Jewish experience, the whole rainbow of descriptions of God remains a gallery of verbal images, which neither are nor ever have been stone hard concepts. Yet, rather than walk away from this of thinking about Jewish monotheism versus Christian Trinitarianism, after Ronner and Moltmann, along with many other contemporary thinkers, we have much smaller discussions over very specifics over volition, structure. The comparison is no longer black and whites of same and difference, but very clear items that I can itemize where the point of difference occurs. In short, Jews and Christians have made different decisions in the 3rd and 4th century that underline theology today. And the goal of comparative theology is to look at 20th and 21st century theology of Rosenzweig, Heschel, Ronner, Moltmann, Soloveitchik, Elizabeth Johnson, and see that we are once again dealing with many of the same issues. However, there's a caveat. I'm not seeking to create a Jewish theology of Christianity, a common theology, a shared mission, or an irenic convergence. I'm not looking to create a universal idea or experience that we share. My goal is to act as a reader of texts and ideas in comparison to basically show that contemporary Jewish and Christian theology are not stereotypes of diametrically opposed religions that they're portrayed to be. I'm specifically leaving out the discussions of those Jewish and Christian thinkers who want to create a common covenant theology, bridging between the two faiths, since that approach is not comparison and contrast, rather a common covenantal call. My openness, which I'll talk about, which is part of my forthcoming book, has several interrelated goals. The first is to explain where the dividing lines are between the religion in our age of openness and understanding. During polemical ages, any difference was magnified into a chasm. Minor variances were treated as unbridgeable divides. And my approach leaves differences in place, but seeks to explain the differences. Second, to explain to Jews why Christian theology is not inscrutable, and to Christians how Jews are a very different theology. And third, to show how the unacknowledged deep convergences in theology in the last half century, that our theologies have converged from mutual exposure to modern life and thought and to each other. Finally, for interfaith work to be meaningful, we need hospitality consisting of more than one-time meetings, rather the hospitality that creates openness to allow theology to come to be. We need to listen to the other faith without preconceived notions. where we should not start with the hermeneutic Jew or the hermeneutic Christian as our starting point, in which we already only work within our own texts. We need to seek the hospitality of other faiths that allow us to go out of our comfort zones and to be humbled and surprised. A hospitality with the other faith that invites further conversation, humility, listening, mutual respect. And interfaith work, especially theology, should, if done well, expose us to moods, sensibilities, attitudes, and inward passages that would otherwise seldom understand within our own tradition. When one crosses into the religious life of another religion and leaving the truths that animate and learning the truths that animate the other belief, the study also means coming back to our own religion and asking new questions. In my own case, it would be a new understanding of my own Judaism and its historic choices and its contemporary options. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am going to begin the responding part of this event. I am Daniel Herskowitz. I am a professor of religious studies at Duke University, and as a moment beginning, I want to start by thanking the organizers of this event for inviting me to participate and offer some thoughts on Professor Brill's really thought-provoking talk. I am a scholar of interfaith dialogue, and as was stated beforehand, I'm currently researching the Jewish involvement in the Second Vatican Council, especially as it concerns the process and the debates over the drafting of what started out as the document on the Jews and evolved into what we know now as Nostra Aetate. One of the things that come out of my research is that in the early 1960s, even in the early 1960s, there was still a lack of readiness, even a difficulty, to think about the other religion on its own terms, rather than as a category operating within one's own religious system. This was certainly true with regards to the Christian perspective on Judaism, but also Jewish perspectives on Christianity. And during the period of the council, there were a lot of interactions and communications between Jewish and Christian representatives dealing with a lot of different issues. But having listened to Professor Brill's talk and upon reflection, a lot of these interactions can be seen as circulating around the question of the relationship between the Jews that are discussed in the document and actual living modern Jews. So, what is the relationship between the theological category of Israel and actual Jews living in the world in the 20th century? And from the other side, are Jews really willing to accept that the church is seriously trying to rethink its relationship to Jews and Judaism? Now, this was a real issue at the time, and it was a real stumbling block because it required a readiness and an ability to approach and even understand the other religion on its own terms, on its own sincere terms, from its own perspective. Now, it's really difficult to ignore how much things have changed since then, from both Jewish and Christian sides. A number of times in his talk, Professor Brill mentioned his ability to understand the Christian choices in Jewish terms. Anyone who is familiar with the history of Jewish and Christian polemics knows that Judaism has traditionally understood Christianity according to specific Jewish terms. But these Jewish terms were usually negative, or at the very least, there were discussions about whether or not these negative categories apply to Christianity. But Professor Brill means here something different when he says to understand Christianity in Jewish terms. What he's talking about is understanding Christianity as taking form out of a certain set of questions or challenges, decisions, choices that are not foreign to Judaism. In fact, they're very familiar to Judaism. But in the Jewish case, these challenges, these questions, these choices were met by different answers or different choices. So this understanding does not wish to overcome or minimize the difference between the two religions, but rather to identify moments in which fateful decisions were made and understand the internal logic and motivation for these decisions. And these decisions really shape the two religions as we know them today. Now, this reflects a respect for the internal integrity of Christianity on both its own terms and Jewish terms. Now, Professor Brill's talk and his work more broadly shows how much things have changed for another reason. Recent scholarship has argued that in the decades after the Second Vatican Council, um, the Catholic world took upon itself the serious task of familiarizing itself with Jewish tradition and learning about Judaism, not simply as an internal category within Christian theology, and not only the Old Testament, but rather understanding or familiarizing itself with Judaism from the perspective of Judaism and the whole span of Jewish tradition. But this claim that was made recently says that this quest for post-Vatican II understanding of the other religion remained essentially an exclusively Catholic matter, because Orthodox Jews did really little to deepen their knowledge of Christian theology, even while they were participating in various forms of interfaith dialogue. So, in other words, the call for mutual understanding was only answered by the Catholic side. And still in Jewish sides, every discussion of Christianity, every halachic decision about Christianity remained in these traditional understandings of even thinking of Christianity as this homogeneous, undifferentiated, monolithic, one thing, Natsut Christianity. Now, this argument was only made with regard to a certain sector within Israeli Orthodoxy, and also it's questionable whether such a broad statement reflects the interfaith dialogue seen in Israel. But this argument does serve a good point with which to contrast the talk that we just heard today. And in preparation for this event, I read a number of chapters from Professor Brill's upcoming book, and the vivid impression that comes from listening to this talk and reading Professor Brill's work is the intimate and profound knowledge and expertise in the minute details of Christian history and theology, from the New Testament to the Church Fathers and all the way to contemporary theologians who are still publishing today. Now, for the sake of opening up a discussion, I want to um, ask a number of questions to Professor Brill. He, of course, does not need to answer all of them or any of them, but I hope that just voicing the questions will be useful for the subsequent discussion and perhaps open some vistas for thought. So my first question is this. Professor Brill claimed in this talk that the fundamental difference between Judaism and Christianity can be presented as the difference between monarchism and modalism. That is, between an understanding of the divine parts as either interrelated and equal, or as holding some kind of hierarchy between them. And he even stated that, and this is a quote, Judaism's hierarchy is the Christian heresy of monarchism. Now, this statement brought to mind a 1952 paper by Paul Tillich titled, Is There a Judeo-Christian Tradition? And Tillich's answer is basically, yes, there is a Judeo-Christian tradition. And he writes, and this is a quote, is it meaningful to say that Christianity is a Jewish or that Judaism is a Christian heresy? He asks, is that meaningful? And then he says, I answer in the affirmative. So my first question is, what are the stakes of thinking of Judaism in terms of a heresy within Christianity and vice versa? So what do we gain? And what are the perils of conceptualizing Judaism, the relationship between them, as the heresy of another? My next question is kind of builds on that. In your talk and in your book, you show that Christian thinkers are now increasingly moved to draw on post-biblical Jewish sources and thinkers as legitimate sources for the construction of a Christian theology. Now, is there a similar move on the Jewish side? Now, of course, historically, as a minority religion within a majority Christian religion, Judaism has always interacted with Christian thought, and examples of influences and migration of ideas are numerous. but rarely are Jewish thinkers open about it or even aware of the role of Christian tradition in their own Jewish thoughts. My question is, in your assessment, are there contemporary Jewish thinkers who are doing this? Are you such a Jewish thinker? As is this a lens or one of the lenses through which we should read and approach approach your own thoughts? Now, my third and penultimate question is this. I found your language of decisions, when you say that, different decisions made by Jews and Christians in the third and fourth century, which led to then dogmatic and experiential differences and really created the two different religions as we know them today. The language of decisions, I found it fascinating and thought-provoking because it inserts an element of contingency into these developments. And theoretically, at least, had different figures in different contexts or with different communal needs been involved during this fateful historical period, perhaps different decisions would have been made or different traditions would have taken form, which had then potentially, theoretically, shaped the evolution of these religions differently. So my question is this: what is the role of contingency or even counterfactuals in your account of the Jewish-Christian difference? And I will conclude with this final question. You finish your talk today saying that, and this is a quote, when one crosses over into the religious life of another religious believer and learns the truths that animate what other religions believes, then coming back to Judaism, so this study also means that coming back to Judaism and asking new questions about Judaism, about its historical choices and its contemporary options. So my final question to you is, having ventured into Christian theology so seriously and so productively, what are the questions that should be asked to Judaism, in your opinion, now, upon returning back to it? So once again, thank you for inviting me to think alongside Professor Brill's wonderful paper and participating in this event.
Thank you very much, Daniil, for your comments in response to Dr. Brill. We'll now turn to Dr. Kuhlman for her response.
Thank you so much, Matthew, and I want to echo the thanks to participate in this event. I think it's has remarkable potential. I also think there is an interesting sort of balance, in a sense, between the previous response and my own. We've really heard about bigger questions of methodology, etc. And in my response, what I want to do is to in a certain sense, do the opposite, drill down and look at detail and look at the arguments that are made here in a material way. I think that it's important to do that. Alan Brill has given us a paper that tackles something at the very heart of Jewish-Christian engagement, certainly Jewish Catholic engagement especially, and has given us a paper that creates a great deal to think about. I want to respond with just a brief comment tonight with a focus on the Christian thinker with whom I have spent the most time, whom I know the best, Thomas Aquinas. Some of you will already know Aquinas is a 13th century thinker who is widely recognized as the thinker after Augustine of Hippo, who's had the most profound influence on Catholic thought. Aquinas is not mentioned in Professor Brill's paper, but he's very important for someone who is mentioned, Karl Rahner. Rahner's wide-ranging system of thought is, in fact, often even described as a kind of rethinking of Aquinas's project. Now, I know that the paper expressed some hesitation about medieval theology, but interestingly, I think that there is actually the possibility of seeing a precedent at play here in Aquinas's thought, and that may underscore the potential for substantive and material engagement between the Jewish and Catholic traditions on this central and sensitive topic of the nature of God. Professor Brill's paper notes that the work of Rahner is extremely important in reconceptualizing and re-articulating the Trinity, and especially of probably the two most important points that Rahner makes. One is his attempt to try to consider an alternative to the language of persons in the Christian doctrine of the Trinity. He has a brief little book titled The Trinity, which had an enormous effect on Christian thinking in the 20th century. So what I want to do here now is just to make three brief points about Aquinas's understanding of the Trinity and perhaps suggest the importance for Rahner. First, we have to note Aquinas's fundamental position about human ability to speak about God. Aquinas's position is that anything we say about God can only be spoken in the form of an analogy. Or to put it in the negative, nothing that we say about God is meant in the same way that it is meant about when we speak about a created thing. This is true of anything. If I say, my grandmother is very loving, and I say God is very loving, the word loving cannot mean the same thing precisely in those two contexts. In fact, to show you how radical this claim is, if I say that my grandmother exists and I say that God exists, I cannot be using the word exists in the same way. So what that means is that all of our language is in an important sense relativized. I want to read you a specific quote from Rahner as he's talking about the Trinity in his little book, and I think you will hear the echo. Insofar as these concepts that we use to describe the Trinity belong to the dogma of the Church, they intend to be only a logical, not an ontic explanation. Not an explanation that applies directly to the being of the thing, in other words. They are an explanation of the state of affairs, which they wish to express, which they wish to express, one which in Scripture and in the pre-Nicene tradition, and even in later doctrinal pronouncements of the Church, could be expressed and has been expressed without reference to such concepts. This does not mean that they are not important. They are quite well suited, almost necessary to safeguard the dogma against tritheistic or modalistic or subordinationalistic misunderstanding. This safeguard function itself shows us that these concepts, rather than directly representing for us the thing which is meant, refer us to the dark mystery of God. These concepts, rather than directly representing for us the thing which is meant, refer us to the dark mystery of God. So I think you can hear the Thomistic echo in Rahner. Second, Aquinas tells us that God is radically simple. Put it in everyday language, there is no sense in which we can speak of parts of God. And for Aquinas, one of the things that means is that there is no sense in which there is any quantity in God. So to speak of three in God is meant even beyond an analogically, but it cannot be taken as a quantitative description. Now, this is probably going to make Professor Brill wonder why he came to this event, but now I'm going to give a direct quote from Aquinas. Aquinas says, if number is taken in the sense of things numbered, in that sense as existing in creatures. One is a part of two and two of three, as one man is part of two men and two of three. This does not apply to God. In fact, at one point, I mean, he's asking the question rhetorically, but Aquinas does say, should we even be using the word Trinity? Here again, quote, such a word does not apply to God as the unity of a collective name is the least of unities. In other words, what Aquinas is saying is there is no sense in which the Trinity can mean that 1 + 1 + 1 equals 3. He goes on to say, all that exists in God exists in the unity of the divine essence. So, my point here is this. It is true to say that Rahner rejects the idea of three separate centers of consciousness, an idea that he believes that many Christians and Catholics have in fact come to hold as they talk about the Trinity and as they use the word persons. But the tradition from which Rahner is drawing most deeply rejects that understanding as well. Now, it is true that the depth of the sense of mystery here, depth of that sense that we see in Aquinas and that we see in Rahner, may present its own challenge. At some point, we may have to ask whether Jews and Catholics mean the same thing when they say one God. But that is a topic for another time. The questions that I want to bring our attention to as we have the conversation is to refer again to this specific question of the nature of threeness, so to speak, in God, and whether and how we see new possibilities emerging. Those are the very questions that I think Professor Brill is encouraging us to ask.
Thank you very much, Holly, for your remarks. We'll now have some time among the panelists to discuss some of the questions that are on the table. Dr. Brill, feel free to respond. Dr. Kuhlman, you as well, to Dr. Herskowitz and vice versa. And then for those of you in attendance who are viewing, we thank you for coming. We are so glad that you are here, and we would like to remind you that question and answer session will come at the end of the program. And if you can see the little button on your screen that says Q&A with a question mark, you can click that and submit some questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but we welcome your participation and your questions as well.
Okay, I will start with Professor Holly Coleman's statements that I agree with 100%. I spent a lot of time with Aquinas and writing papers comparing Maimonides to Aquinas, and I've been dancing around David Burrell's be able to compare Farabi to Maimonides to Aquinas for quite a long time. Didn't produce the sort of QED, therefore we can talk to each other. It was a sort of abstract philosophic point. And I agree with you 100% of what you brought from Aquinas. I should have emphasized the Thomistic element of Rahner more. I mean, that was certainly something I should have included more, and 2 more paragraphs wouldn't have killed me on that. But I love the quote you brought me. But there was a certain point of pushing it beyond David Burrell's, oh, look, I can do a comparison on essence and existence or freedom and creation, or even on proofs for God, is pushing it to the theological direction. So I was completely guilty. I should have included, and I should have actually caught that Rahner thing because I read through the Rahner tract on Trinity quite well. I should have caught that and included that one also. But I think they're all points very well taken that I'm not disagreeing with. But at that point, when we've traveled quite a distance, and I've been in graduate school quite a while ago, in which post-Vatican II, it was enough the fact that they let me into the graduate school, which was a novelty. But the fact at that point, unity of religions either went in a mystical universal direction, a Raman Panikar direction, or it became a much more scholastic activity, but to actually say we're having a similar conversation. Yes, I did. I left out the medieval part because it was more technical tonight, but I grant almost everything you say. And I was really jumping from late antiquity to modernity. But no real difference here. And trust me, I've got my own thoughts and where Albert the Great and other such pieces of contingency could have fit in. Going to Professor Hershkowitz's many questions. Let's see if I can get through them, all of them. To work backwards in some level, the answer is yes. I do think we should go forward theologically. I definitely think this should be an activity we engage in, read each other's theology and understand it and do comparative from whatever century you're specializing in. But clearly, as you point out, the incredible tentativeness of 60s and 70s, where even Abraham Joshua Heschel said he's going to deal from a position of depth theology and not theology in his critiques of Christian thought. And even going into the beginning of the 21st century, Professor Rabbi David Novak's saying, I'm not going to get involved in the technicalities of Christian theology. I'm going to look at the ethical base. It really wasn't done. And therefore, I'm saying this is time. I mean, that's probably the point. And I'm in some ways starting a discussion rather than thinking I've got the answers already. In terms of contingency, I'm going to have two senses here. Yes, I think there's contingency. I can always open up David Bentley Hart for a completely get an incredible sense of contingency of things I didn't know and alternative Christian theologies from his reading of church fathers as like unlike whatever is in my standard versions, but also coming from a certain hermeneutic, post David Tracy, and where the texts are capacious. There is a certain contingency in all this. At some level, you do think that there were clearly, whether you think there was Holy Spirit or clear things that had to be made, clear decisions that had to be made. But there clearly is a contingency and capaciousness to this, which gets me back to the first question. So modalism and monarchism are two separate heresies. They're not the same. But the point is, I don't think we use the language of heresy anymore. It's not that heresy had a clear function of being excluded. It was a social political category. It was not just a theological one. You were being excluded from the discourse. In our rather capacious age, in which we're not excluding, heresy goes much more closer to the Peter Berger sense. The heretical imperative is that there are lots of choices, lots of contingencies, lots of positions that are out there. And that's really where the conversation starts. I'm not seeing Judaism as a Christian heresy, but I do understand that in the early centuries, these would have been those positions. And I know there were church fathers who were rejected for them, but that's certainly not the way, even post Aquinas's sense of language that we are all, that sense that these are not hard and fast metaphysics. And today it doesn't really gel into a heresy. So don't like that whole approach. Finally, what should we be reading now? You should be reading everything. There's so much theology coming out. We should both be reading each other. We should both, be commenting on each other's thoughts. There's no one specific, there's no one specific point, but there is clearly a conversation to be had. Meaning, hold on, what did I just read? I just read, let me see if I have it at my hand. No, meaning I read lots of stuff in which I now see parallels between Christian and Jewish thought dealing with the same issues on disability, on climate, on all sorts of AI. We should all be looking at each other's stuff and commenting, why are we going in different directions when we talk about it? As a very, or even when we talk about it, should really be a good starting point.
Thank you very much, Alan, for your response. Are there any other comments or questions from the panelists? Dr. Brill, I had a question. I had thought that perhaps it would be important to think about the question of convergence. One of your points is that there's a convergence right now between Jews and Catholics and Christians in their theological work. There's a chance for us to understand each other, perhaps that we have not experienced in the past. That is a moment of opportunity. And that understanding can be, as you've argued, theological concepts, including. At the same time, some at this moment feel that there's a crisis in Catholic-Jewish relations, that the Catholic-Jewish relations must be revived, and there's a concern about the current political situation and whatnot. What would you say to this basic idea of perhaps someone saying, I'll take a more realistic view. I don't think there's a convergence.
Those are two separate things. One of them is Jews and Christians have better understanding of each other's text and theology. Meaning Jews are showing up at Gregorian Angelicum. Catholics are showing up at Hebrew U. You look at the College of Cardinals recently, how many of them have studied at Hebrew U or have studied in Israel. There is a huge convergence in which we understand each other in ways we never did. There's a way that we actually have an understanding that we don't make the faux pas that would have been made 50 years ago. And it's a continuous process. On the other hand, political social attitudes toward the state of Israel, toward the Gaza-Israel war, toward anti-Semitism, toward American politics, can create all sorts of tensions, but it doesn't lead to us forgetting our sense of theological understanding, and our sense of friendship and hospitality. Going back to Pope Benedict had been to Israel 4 times and read new Jewish books. So did Cardinal Casper, even if there were all sorts of tensions about the SSPX and all sorts of tensions that kept coming up. Those are tensions in the dialogue between people and politics, but that's not the state of understanding. Pope Francis came in with friends who were Jews and helping out in the Argentine community. He continued in it. He encouraged it. And if there's now going to be a difference over the Gaza war, that doesn't take away everybody's theological knowledge and our point of incredible understanding and convergence we have right now.
Thank you, Alan. There's a question from an attendee. They have a question about Rahner's views and whether there's a resonance of these views in Jewish theology. And the question in particular is about Rahner's view of responding to God's call, or responding to God or being oriented to God. In Rahner, is it similar to perspectives in Jewish theology?
That's very much so. I mean, there are many Rahnerians who see Heschel as their dialogue partner, and Heschel people who see their Rahner as their dialogue partner. In fact, William Dyke, the translator of Rahner, was unfortunately the person who discovered that Heschel had died. I mean, there was a clear Rahnerian connection there and talking in Rahnerian terms. But as Professor Hershkowitz points out, you weren't acknowledging it in those days, saying, oh, we're going to have a common conversation and say, here's where we're the same and different, even though there are many resonances that are out there. Heschel preferred the language of prophecy, empathy, sympathy, which is not the same as the Rahnerian hearer of the word, but there are many of that existential direction in which both of them are conceiving the task.
Thank you very much, Alan.
You're muted.
Thank you very much. I think this brings us to the conclusion of our program. Unless there are any other thoughts or comments from the panelists, I want to just extend my own thanks to Dr. Brill for his presentation, which I find is a major achievement and a major opening of a door. You finished on this point about hospitality, and you have provided that to Christian thinkers and Catholic thinkers like myself in opening the door, welcoming me into a space where I can learn from you and your understanding of resonances about Catholic understanding, Christian understanding of God. So thank you, Alan, for deepening the Christian-Jewish dialogue in a significant theological way that's very meaningful. To our attendees, just a reminder, this is a public program that is kicking off a scholarly symposium that began today at 2 p.m. We will run all the way to Wednesday around 11 a.m. And there are 12 scholars, an international group of top-notch scholars meeting to discuss various categories in Jewish theology specifically. So Jewish theology has the spotlight. And then there are Catholic scholars responding and engaging in dialogue. So, Alan, we hope to carry out the hospitality that you have called us to over the next few days. Thank you to the attendees for tuning in tonight. This video program will be recorded, and you will be able to find it on the CCGS YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have a lovely evening.